My name is Misha Glenny. I am the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences here in Vienna, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here, along with our collaborators, the newspaper Der Standard, the Burgtheater itself, and the CEST Foundation for this debate on the global right. In an earlier incarnation, I was the BBC's Central Europe correspondent in the 1980s and early 1990s here in Vienna, and I witnessed extraordinary events in history across Eastern Europe with the revolutions and then much more darkly the wars in the former Yugoslavia. But I'm beginning to think that even these monumental events are slightly paling in comparison to what is happening in the world today, especially since the inauguration of Donald Trump as President of the United States for the second time on the 20th of January. So we wish to double down on our commitment to have open and respectful public debates about the major issues which are now facing us here in Austria, in Europe, and around the world. So we have gathered together a really excellent set of guests for you to hear this morning. And please join me in welcoming our four guests and our moderator, Gerold Riedmann from Der Standard. Please, thank you.
So a very good morning or a nice Sunday. It's a day where we celebrate, where we are celebrating democracy. That's what I wanted to say, because it's election day in Vienna, and on the other hand side, Austria celebrates its 80th anniversary of the re-establishment of the Austrian Republic. This country was until then part of the Nazi regime. Today we hear a marching band outside and try to discuss here the future of democracy and if it has a future, or how the recent developments of especially the global right have changed that. It's a birthday for the Republic in challenging times. We're also 100 days into the Trump presidency, as I'd like to call it. It's 1,358 days to go. So it's well above, slightly below 1,400 days to go, if the King of America is by then willing to go into another election. The US is the most recent example of things that can go wrong in a democracy. I'm very interested to hear if you all have seen that coming, if you had the crystal ball, if the foreseeable future is still something that is existing, because I don't know where the foreseeable future should lead us to. So transnational authoritarian processes, that's impacting all of us, and you all know that. But the one thing you don't know is what we have here with knowledge on the podium. I'm very glad that we have Sylvie Kauffmann, foreign affairs columnist and editorial director at Le Monde from Paris here in Vienna. We have Jagoda Marinić. She's a writer, publicist. Your podcast has the word freedom in it, freedom deluxe. Is it a luxury? We'll find out. Jan Werner Müller, professor of social sciences at Princeton University, maybe looking for a new place to do your studies in Europe. And Soli Öztl, Turkish well-known figure. You have been a journalist, you're a publicist. You have taught and are teaching in Istanbul, in Chicago, or let's be specific, in Evanston, next to Chicago, yes, where Northwestern University is located, and is at this point currently visiting fellow at the IWM, the Institute for Human Sciences here in Vienna, that we're proud to partner with. Sylvie, Let's start not with the French situation that we'll come back to in a minute, but Trump has already destroyed so much in the first 100 days. Are you personally still in the state of denial? Have you seen it coming? Is it worse than you expected? You had been living in the States and reporting from Washington also for years, back in the 90s, I guess. Was it a surprise to you?
First of all, good morning, and thank you very much for having me. It's great to be in Vienna. Was it a surprise? I think what he's doing is not really surprising, but the speed with which he's doing it, he's carrying out his agenda is, I think, is surprising. There is part of what he's doing is implementation of this so-called Project 2025, which was written by this conservative think tank, Heritage Foundation. But from what, and Jagoda will tell us more about this probably, but it was not supposed to be implemented during the campaign. And it's really interesting that he's doing it, in fact, partly. So there is a surprise, the speed, how far he's going with, of course, on the diplomatic front, what he's doing with Russia is surprising. I think nobody really saw this coming. And what he's doing with internally with the presidential, expanding the presidential power. I read a couple of days ago, he gave this interview to Time magazine. It's really very enlightening on his way of thinking. For instance, he's asked whether he's concentrating presidential power, whether he's, seizing power from institutions and concentrating those powers into the presidency. And he says, I'm doing what I campaigned on, and I was elected. I'm doing this. I'm using the presidency. I'm using it per my election. So it's like I have a mandate because I've been elected by the people, and then I can do what I want with the institutions. And this is something he didn't do, I think, to that length in the first term. And if I may, and I will end with this. This is something we notice, maybe I could call it the first-term syndrome. We saw that with Orban, with Viktor Orban. We saw that with the Kaczynskis in Poland, who were in power, failed to implement their agenda because there was this expression of legal impossibilism because they found legal obstacles to implement their agenda. They were not prepared to take over completely. So when they come back, they are much better organized, they are much better prepared, and they decide that the legal obstacles don't have to block their agenda. And I think this is what we see with Trump, that in the first term he couldn't carry out what he wanted. And so in the second term, he's coming back, but much more forcefully, and he doesn't mind overthrowing, seizing powers from the institutions.
One of the institutions that there has been a lot of talk about, and there has been a lot of news, has been Harvard, but that's only one university. It's the whole academia that's under fire. And your president of Princeton, Christopher Eisgruber, has been very clear from the beginning where the university stands. And I think that leads you as well into some challenges, let's say it this way, on the short hand. How much under fire are you? And how is that situation going to run further?
So let me start by saying that I agree with Sylvie's point that when far-right populists come to power the second time, it's much more dangerous because they're prepared, they've learned something, they know how to go after the institutions immediately, they don't waste too much time on culture war. But in a sense, Trump is going beyond this established model of what some of our colleagues in social science call autocratic legalism, where, like Orban, you try to keep up a facade of legality, you try to keep fooling the European Commission, Angela Merkel, all kinds of people, trying to convince them that what you're doing is actually procedurally correct, is still legal, and so on. And Trump has moved beyond that very quickly. Is doing things which are plainly illegal. In fact, he's acting much more in the way that he used to act as a, in quotation marks, businessman. Do something that everybody knows is illegal, and then see what happens. Are they going to go to court? Maybe we'll find a settlement outside court. So it's way beyond this established model, and hence also much more dangerous. Part of the reason why he goes beyond that established model is, of course, that unlike Orban, Kaczynski, maybe to some degree Erdogan, he doesn't have to care about any outside actors. There's no European Commission to please. There are no international organizations to fool. So in that sense, we are already in a situation where you feel there are no obvious limits to what he can do. And to get to your question finally, that's exactly what we've also already seen in the case of the attack on universities. It's not unusual that aspiring autocrats attack universities. They all do that sooner or later. Independent institutions, sources of expertise and judgment that are independent. Also, if I may add, concentration of young people who very often are much more willing to be upset about political and moral issues. All of that is dangerous for aspiring autocrats. So it's not surprising that we saw this attack. What's surprising is that there's not even a pretense of following the procedures. Let's say you are convinced that there is widespread anti-Semitism at a particular university. You may be right, but then you would basically go through the steps, you would have a hearing, you would investigate, you would give the university a chance to respond, to make its case. Instead, it's basically just simply freezing the money, which translates into things like we're not going to have a cure for a certain kind of cancer. So this is not just, Trotsky is Professor so-and-so can no longer corrupt the youth with his crazy post-structuralist theories. I mean, this has real consequences for people on the ground, and yet they're doing it in the most illegal possible way. So from our point of view, it looks like, okay, anything can happen. It's not like there's going to be an obvious limit because they're trying to fool people into thinking that they actually care about the rule of law.
And quick question, it's not only Ivy League universities, it's academia.
Well, of course, they kind of picked on certain universities. I think, in a sense, I mean, this can sound a little bit like conspiracy theory, but I think it's not crazy. They wanted to provoke a fight with Harvard, partly to show what instruments they can possibly still use. So, tax on the endowment, making it very difficult for international students to come. If that happens, the latter part, international students, that is potentially catastrophic for many universities and colleges in red states in particular, because they pay high fees. So so-called in-state students in the American South, for instance, actually are de facto subsidized by, to put it bluntly, Chinese students, for instance. If that stops, even people who voted for Trump, in theory at least, will realize, okay, that's actually not a great idea in terms of how our higher education system runs. So in that sense, it's not totally arbitrary who is being targeted. We are targeted, as you say, because our president took a strong stance very early on. Immediate retaliation, as we now know. This administration runs on revenge. That's sort of its fuel. But it's not just so-called elite universities.
Jagoda Marinić joining us from Heidelberg, I guess, this weekend. Freedom, we talked about that expression, or not only expression, a concept, a hope, a desire for so many of us. And now it's the land of the free that's turning completely in the opposite direction. Is freedom becoming a luxury good, or has it always been?
I think it has always been. We considered it normal, but we should have been very aware of the fact that it's been something that our predecessors fought for, died for, and really it was nothing that we could take for granted ever. And when we speak about Trump, always at the same time try to remind myself of the United States that attracted me. So what have we lost by now having the narrative that Trump, we do this, we meet here, we gather, what is he taking away? And I really take all my energy so I will not forget what the United States used to be, what I used to believe in, what were the ideas of freedom, even though they have never achieved them themselves in many aspects. But we should be careful, I think, when we talk about Trump, that he himself is, I think, representing him as the king, but we, by discussing about him the way we do, we create the monster he wants to be. I became aware of this when I watched the Ezra Klein video, when he said, don't believe him. We always say, he said what he wants to do, believe him, but he said in another aspect, don't believe him, because he does all these things, but then the United States is still much more than Trump. You know, there are still institutions, there are still people standing up against him. And when we talk about everything he does, rightly so, to criticize it, we should be very conscious of the synchronicity of events that the world today is creating. So I think when we speak about Trump, I think of all the people that at the same time realize that they have to defend democracy. They realize they have to fight for democracy. We have now seen people coming out for democracy. And what also fascinates me is when I hear you say that they are so well prepared for their second terms. We've seen that everywhere. To me, it was astonishing that the Democrats were never prepared. They come for the second time and everybody is like, oh, we've had these people before, but we thought we could go on as if they wouldn't exist. So we are not prepared. And I always wonder about this part of our society. Maybe there's something that we should learn to focus on, and how can we be prepared? They have their plans for 2025. Trump had it, now he's implementing it. The AfD has their plans for 2029. They are trying rigorously to implement this. But what are the plans that the Democrats have for 2029? And that go beyond defending the plans, stopping the plans that the others have for 2029. So I think when we think about the state the world is in, we should always broaden our own minds and not be trapped in the world they're selling us, and be trapped in defending, describing, and re-narrating the world that they are creating, but always at the same time narrating and thinking about the world we need to create, the world we need to do, the way we need to be prepared to defend. You spoke about this value, freedom, as we had it for a lot of years, and what a privilege it is if you look at the history of mankind. It is a privilege. We haven't had it for a long time.
Yeah, decision to make in every newsroom around the globe, yeah. A decision you have to make in every newsroom around the globe. Reporting what Trump is saying, what he's doing. The whole planet is afraid of Trump, and he's watching it on Fox News and enjoying it very much, I guess. Soli Özal, during Trump's first presidency, he tried to, somehow be in that vision, or in that lie of being a real president and respecting democracy up to a certain point. Now he's not caring anymore. We were talking about that we don't have any hints of what the foreseeable future will bring, but I'm asking you anyway, how to cope with leaders that defy or deny legal norms and that don't care anything. We shouldn't be afraid of them, I heard.
Nope. Well, anyway, good morning. Look, in such gatherings, it is customary for us to immediately quote an Italian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci. Nowadays, I prefer quoting an American novelist, William Faulkner. Because Faulkner said something in one of his novels: the past is not dead, it's not even the past. And in fact, what we are seeing is the resurrection, and last week was Easter, the resurrection of a tradition in the United States that was always present. In this week's Financial Times weekend edition, there is a fine article by Simon Schama, and he talks about a guy I've never heard of before called Billy Sunday, who would say that all those college graduates would go straight to hell, that it was guaranteed that they were going to go to hell, 99%. So that tradition of anti-intellectualism, that tradition of paranoia, had existed but was submerged during the liberal era. That's the 80 years of both Austria's existence as a second republic, but also the so-called liberal order, which had been limping in the last maybe couple of decades. So this is all coming to haunt us back, and therefore the struggle in which Trump personifies is, do we maintain what we had in the past 8 years as our ideal way of running things, that is the end of history thesis, or do we go back to that alternative tradition which defines the West not as a liberal construct, but as a white Christian male construct? So that's something we need to take into account. Second, I really very much doubt, that Trump came to power the first time as a Democrat. He was just constrained. He didn't know what the hell to do. And there were other people. But the thing is, the way we treated him, I think, was also very condescending. What does it mean to say, oh, there are adults in the room, to a person who just one way or another got elected president of the United States? And I think that fueled his resentments, and now he's coming back in revenge. One other thing I'd like to point, I hope that's part of our discussion as well. I really think this populist wave, the tilt towards authoritarianism, also has something to do with the way our economies are organized now. I mean, who supported Trump this time? Who is the henchman that he has today? Elon Musk. Who is Elon Musk? He represents the tech companies, no? And the tech companies have no reason to care about democracy. Peter Thiel is very famous for having written already in 2009 that he doesn't think freedom and democracy go together. So the way the economy is organized, was organized in the post-45 period, necessitated mass participation. That is not what the technology-driven economy actually needs or cares about. So unless we talk about the positions that economic elites take, we really cannot discuss the full picture of populism and the authoritarian drift, and therefore we cannot really find ways of fighting it. So there are, but the thing is, and I'll conclude with this, there is a tilt towards authoritarianism, and I come from a country which has written the handbook on it, or co-authored. But I also see that along with that authoritarian drift, there is also resistance. And I think the dialectic between the drift and the resistance and how that will come about at the end is going to be the most important thing. That struggle is going to be the most important thing for the future.
Jan Werner Müller, the way we communicate, don't want to stand. The way we communicate has changed dramatically over the 2 last decades. Let's think 15 years back, Arabian Spring. Some thought for 2 weeks, I guess, that all could only happen by the gift of social media. Now, 15 years later, I guess some views have changed. What makes social media such a fertile ground for populism, for authoritarian regimes and propaganda in the end?
I'm glad we have 3 hours left to answer this very simple question.
Only asking small questions.
Allow me to say 2 things. So one thing is that there's something perversely comfortable of settling into a kind of technological determinism. With every media innovation, there has been the tendency to say, oh, it politically can only mean this. The invention of printing, of course, wars of religion. The invention of radio, of course, Hitler. TV, McCarthy, and now social media, populism. And as you can tell, it's never as simple as that. Every media innovation comes on top of existing media infrastructures. So if you look at the United States, yes, it's crazy. Nobody can deny that. The fact that you can convince millions of people that, yes, in Washington, D.C., there is a pizzeria, and underneath Hillary Clinton captures young boys, etc., etc. But to say that this is the future of humanity and that everywhere it's going to be like this overlooks the fact that before social media, as everybody in this room knows, we already had Fox, we already had talk radio, we already had a very particular media infrastructure. As a result, not of technology, but of very specific decisions in the 1980s under the Reagan administration about the deregulation of cable, radio, etc. It's hard to believe, but the medium with which Americans still spend most time is radio. Because when you think about these long commutes, you're not going to check your Facebook feed, you're not going to watch TV, you are going to listen to some, usually old white man who will indeed tell you that all these college graduates are going to go to hell. So, in other words, I think we can't generalize about what's going to happen. Second point, though, and this is where I agree with you, it's also true, as a number of people have said, that when you think about a basic challenge in politics, which is how do you mobilize people? How do you get people to go out there and vote for you? Question today in Vienna, obviously. There are only so many models that we can think of. One is clientelism. Vote for me, and I'm going to give you something. Some material benefit, some bureaucratic favor, something along those lines. And then secondly, the great invention of social democratic parties in the 19th century, including in Austria, basically party bureaucracy. Lots of members who go out there, knock on doors, and get you to the polling booth. Up until social media, these are more or less the only options. Now it's possible for a hitherto relatively obscure guy in Brazil to stand in his backyard with his cell phone and record himself, and all of a sudden, reach millions of people and become Bolsonaro the president. Because at least initially, before big business swung behind him, there really was nothing else. So that, in a sense, yes, that's new. That possibility was not there before. And, importantly, if you mobilize people this way, I think it's true that there is a kind of inbuilt dynamic for radicalization. In a sense, you have to tell people at every election, look, everything is at stake. Because otherwise, they might not be mobilized, they might not turn out for you again. So in a sense, yes, you have an incentive to basically ratchet things up all the time and say that, the other side is evil, is the enemy, you got to come out and do it for me again. So in that sense, yes, the potential is there, the danger is there, but it's not since you're always looking for optimism, I'm sure, it's not a given, it is not predetermined.
Yeah, my journey to optimism today. Jagoda, the book you wrote not many months ago, it was published, asks for soft radicalism, not to be too pushy, too loud, but to have a long strategy of reaching things. The noise level that's now out there with the presidency of Trump, I couldn't imagine it to be any louder. It's on full throttle. It's noise all the time. How to go further with soft radicalism in such loud times?
I mean, we think because we're here and we like this kind of gathering and this kind of discussion that many people like it, do it. But if you talk about media, there's more and more people who don't like it, who don't consume media, who say it's so loud and noisy, I don't want to be part of this. So I think we have to learn to have those parallel realities, that some people are profiting from the loud and noisy thing, from the malutilization of social media, and then many people are completely cutting off. And I'm also interested in these people. Why are they cutting off? How can I get them back? What can I offer to make people engaged in this kind of democracy? Will I try to talk about content only with those where I have to defend the most basic things, or even know that they will not really engage in an argument because they have their agenda and they're just using this argument to promote their agenda? So gentle radicalism, or soft radicalism, as you say, was an attempt for me to offer to especially the younger generation maybe an exit out of the last 10 years where many progressive movements thought the louder and noisier we are, the better we can counter the loud and noisy. And actually by using those means, they came more and more alike. And our democracies were spiraling into something. We have a noise made by the progressives, by those who fight for human rights, and then we have the noise of the right extremists and of the authoritarians. And who's winning with all that noise? It's the oligarchs you just talked about. Because when we engage in this sort of digital civil war that they want, we spend our times in social media fighting and raging, and rage became the feeling that once used to foster progressive movements, and now it's just fostering and channeling into the richness of those oligarchs. So what I'm trying to say is, if we maybe rethink rage in an era of digital movements, if we rethink connection, community, responsibility towards each other. And we just say, okay, I can fight for democracy, but I don't have to go into social media and defend all of this against the noisy and loud and be the counter to Trump, be the opposite of Trump, but create another space where we build democracies, where we build our communities, where we create values, where we create connection, and this way foster a city that I want to live in, a surrounding that I trust, also reduce the complexity of this global crisis that we're in, because many people feel so overwhelmed. Where do you want to start? Which crisis do you want to talk about? And where do you want to move yourself towards so you can make a change? Many people feel very overwhelmed by this. And young people thought that being progressive means being loud, canceling people, shouting out loud, shitstorming them on social media. And suddenly these means have become boomerang. It was the right-wingers who said, look, they are so aggressive. It's those who are the authoritarians. They are the danger for democracy. They are those who are against free speech. So I'm actually looking for ways with this concept of gentle radicalism in my book to offer young people the idea that they can engage in old democratic structures. They can engage into their community. They can engage into their cities. They can use the march through the institutions as they have been used by the 60s movements, you know? Because who's doing that at the moment? It's the right-wingers who are doing it. They are using democratic tools to gain power like Trump did to then destroy those democratic surroundings. So I think what we need to relearn also is to create a new progressive agenda, to form new means of connection, to not burn out by being more angry than they are or being the better people than they are, but to really develop visions, to create spaces where we think about how can we live better, how can we afford housing, because that's actually what pulls the people towards those rights activists. I think there's a deep distrust in that any of those liberal democratic parties really think about solutions anymore. And through the vacuum that has created, the right extremists have gotten a great entrance. It's like riding in on a horse. And to me, it's like, how can we fill that vacuum? How can we come back to solution making? And I'm afraid we're not going to come there by constantly saying Trump is so loud and being louder than Trump and putting all our energy into social media, though I think social media is still a fantastic tool. It still offers fantastic opportunities. We should not demonize it. It all depends on how educated we are to use it, and how much we are in control of what they program in these tools. But yeah, gentle radicalism is really to not think we have to engage into the civil war that they're trying to bring us into in our societies. Like, are you with me, are you against me? This kind of tribalism that we've been through the last 10 years. Yeah. I think we have to come into something where one community, we're one planet, we have to come into a problem-solving mode together.
Yeah, that might be the case by... That might be the case by the high contrast thinking, black, white, 1-0, might bring tech people and authoritarian thinking people together. Sylvie, you had been editor-in-chief of Le Monde. You are a journalist for your life. You're directrice at Le Monde. You're writing every week about political tendencies and your opinion pieces. What's the approach at Le Monde, hearing all of this, writing about Trump and taking this as a stance for all the other developments?
I was listening to Jagoda, and I totally agree that there are various things that you all said which are worth coming back to. First, Democrats are not prepared when they come back to power. That's also, that's very true, and that goes to also your opinion that we need a progressive agenda to counter this rise of populist right movements. I think this is a big failure of liberal thinking and liberal actors and liberal democracy in a way that we thought, and this is where I go to my paper and probably yours too, responsibility. We we assumed that we had won. Yeah, that liberal democracy had won, that universalism had won, and this is going back to what Misha Glenny said in the introduction. I also covered, like him, the fall of communism and the transition to new democracies in Europe, and we didn't have any idea that at that time that we could go back, right? I don't think it was in our mental universe that there could be such a backlash. And so we went on, and we ignored, on our way to this kind of victorious path, we ignored what was going wrong. Solly spoke about the condescending attitude to Donald Trump. I think we had a condescending attitude to a lot of to voters, of people who elected Donald Trump or people who voted for Marine Le Pen, which is a third of our electorate in France and in many other countries in Europe. So we decided that, well, they are wrong. And when you have a third or a majority, in that case, in the United States of the voters who make such decisions when they go to the polls, you have to pay attention, and you have to understand what is the root of the problem, and you have to work on what went wrong, what did have a review, self-criticism, and all our and then work on an agenda to counter those political parties. And so that's where I think our papers have a responsibility. We live in a bubble, in an intellectual bubble, I think, and we are very reluctant to go out of that bubble. I took part in the debate recently in a Paris university, one of the best universities. It was about Ukraine, and we had a wonderful debate. and afterwards, a student, and this was a student in political science in a good university. And she said, well, this is very interesting what you say, but, I take my news from social media, and this is not what they say. And I said, which social media? And she said, TikTok and Instagram. And I thought, well, if we have students of good universities in political science in Paris, which only take their news from TikTok and Instagram, we're in real trouble. And this is true. And I think this is where we failed, to reach these people. So we have to make a really big effort to look at what went wrong, what we did wrong, and be more creative about how we're going to solve this issue, I think.
Solly, let's come a little bit to Europe. And we could sit here hours talking about Trump and how bad he is and how he's destroying democracy. What does it do with Europe? Does it make us stronger, or are the Orbans and the Le Pens and here in Austria, well, Kickl would like to be in that row, but let's say the FPO, have they gotten too far so that it's just making us stronger and everything will be fine?
I think Jan said earlier that these movements could not become internationalist, but there is an attempt, obviously. Remember that this conservative political action conference took place in Hungary 2 years ago, and Orban is one of the favorite leaders in Europe of Mr. Trump. And my hunch is that obviously what goes on in the United States does have an impact on what goes on in the rest of the world, and of course in Europe as well. And there is a conflation of mindsets, I think, and as I said earlier, I really believe the rights agenda in the States and possibly in Europe as well is really to redefine what we knew as the West. And that definition is no longer going to be a liberal definition of the West, but again, male, Christian, and white. And I also suspect that part of the reason why Trump or J.D. Vance are so sympathetic towards Russia is because that's how Putin also presents himself, right? He is the defender of the white Christian realm. And the sectarian divisions do not really necessarily matter any longer. But at the end of the day, it is really what you do politically to fight that tendency. Why is the center eroding, and why are the radicals gaining ground? It's because it's not just Le Pen, it's also Mélenchon in France. One of the things that really drew my attention in the German elections, everybody expected the AfD to do well, but I mean, if you put Die Linke plus Sarah Wagen, I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry. Her party's votes together is 14%. This is not something to be dismissed easily. So the two of them together are 35%. That suggests, again, one of Jan's arguments is so long as the center-right takes the radical right's arguments, they lose ground to the radical right rather than gaining ground. There was a commercial back in the 1980s in the United States. One of the famous British actors was there, the person who's enunciating things. It's a company that no longer exists. He used to say, they make money the old-fashioned way. They earn it. So if you really want to get back on the political game and then gain ground, you really then have to put a lot of effort on knocking on doors, working, mobilizing your own members first, and then help and ask them to mobilize the public, have an agenda that is believable, and basically answer, as Jagoda said, answer the questions that most people have. Will they have a house? Will they have guarantees of a secure retirement? And those are really the essential questions that people care about. And then you can move on to the more esoteric things such as, freedom of speech, democracy, rule of law, and all those things. Because it wasn't as if when 48.5% of the American electorate that bothered to vote, by the way, voted for Trump, it's not as if they did not know who Trump was or what Trump actually was going to do. But obviously they didn't care. And on that, it's interesting. I think exit polls suggested that both people who voted for Kamala Harris and people who voted for Trump both said that they care a lot about democracy. But what they meant about democracy were very different. For Kamala Harris voters, when they said they cared about democracy, it was rule of law, separation of powers, freedom of speech, and all that. For the other guys, and when you look at the American political trajectory from the 90s onwards, the working people have been losing ground in terms of income, security, and all that. And for them, the thing was, look, we've been constantly nagging on our politicians, on our politicians, saying, we are suffering, do something for us. And they haven't. And Trump heard us. If we are the demos, our politicians should have responded to us, and they haven't. And therefore, my understanding of democracy is, will that particular politician actually care about my needs, all right? If they don't, then I'll go for Trump, who will not deliver. But that will be the disappointment part. We'll see how it all goes.
The question of
may
what
I
we're
just
taking...
Before a new question, because I liked your thought about when you said what people care about is to have a house. But what's in this dream, that's actually the promise that democracy used to be. You can be born, you can earn a house, you get a vote, you have a say, you have a meaning. Yeah. And the crazy moment we're in this democracy is that nobody or too many people don't believe in this promise anymore. And that paradoxically, in these times, it's the oligarchs who use this dream, abuse it, and trigger them. If you believe in us, we're going to pull you there. We're going to create the world that gives you a say. We talked about media and how dangerous social media is. But on the other hand, media was also in a huge crisis. If you speak of democracy and having a vote and having a say, I think it is harder for a working class kid to enter a newsroom 20 years ago and I mean, tackle those mostly white men and present your worldview than it is in social media. So what is Musk doing? He's triggering the innovation. He says we're going to have citizenship media because people want to say they want to co-create the world. So I think the problem is that really the Democrats don't have the promises, and the politicians can make people believe that those promises will be, anybody cares about those promises, and in this aspect, corruption enters, and self-satisfaction, and coziness, and people think it's an elite that's in itself quite happy. That's what happened to Kamala Harris and the Democrats. They are safe sort of in their world, and they are taking care of us. Though they're just abusing this rhetoric, but it's them who have owned the promise. And I think if democratic and liberal democracies don't learn to take back that promise, they take back the idea of innovation, what's going to happen in the future? It will be the broligarchs who, by selling this, by selling, we can fly you to the moon, you can become a woman flying to the moon.
Katy Perry.
Yeah, but that's what
Not
we
to the
sell
moon.
to the people, and they get so self-alienated that they believe the narrative because we've been trained to believe those images. So I think we have no other choices than really taking the promise of democracy far more serious and thinking about who's going to bring in the innovation. And we have the paradox situation that those who are sort of caring for the end of democracy are promising them more democratic future. So if we don't sort of resolve that paradox, we cannot come back to a democratic resilience and a democratic power. So I think it's all about us and how we use our powers.
That's your applause that's going to come. But we'll stick, and I don't want to hinder that. I want to stick at that point for 1 second. I'll come back to you in a minute. If I'm not mistaken, you got your German citizenship when you were 20 years old.
I was 20, I don't know, 20-something.
I heard you saying the sentence that you only know the power of the German passport if you're not owning it. Are we taking things, you said there is no purpose, not enough purpose for democracy, kind of. Are we taking things too much for granted?
You know, sometimes when I sit in these beautiful places, I almost take it for granted or forget. But my parents come from Yugoslavia, from former Yugoslavia, from a very rural area. We forget how poor parts of Europe were. I spent a lot of time in Spain. They had the same phenomenon. So we have many people whose grandparents were peasants living almost under medieval conditions. So this whole European idea of people going to Germany, going to the UK to have a better life, we almost forgot this, how much sacrifice lies within this Europe. And the country where my parents come from has fought a war for freedom, like the Ukrainians are now fighting. So I have sacrificed a lot of things to get an education. Now I see many young people who are very privileged born that they think I don't need that much of an education, I don't need this or that. I have had no bigger dream than education, because that was what I had no access to. My parents were not educated. So I really think that, and that's what I mean with those dreams and things we have earned. There is one segment of the institutional democratic European world, let's call it, that is so saturated and that is so satisfied in its elitist privilege that it has inherited over decades. There has been tons of studies about how little movement is possible between the classes, even in Europe. For Germany, I know for sure you need 6 generations for people to make the way I have done in one life, from one generation to another. So if we don't make people believe that you can make this dream come true. My parents moved to Germany for a dream of a better economic life. If they were normal workers, uneducated, and they could create a better life, they could create a next generation that is part of an academic world, that is part of an artistic world. So if we rip Europe of all those dreams that we sometimes thought are American dreams, but they're also European dreams. If we rip ourselves of this identity and of the belief in this permeability of a system, I think we're going to bring people to where many of them are now, in this lethargic, apathetic, almost, I call it Romanian way of life. When I was doing a theater project in Romania, all the interviews I did to the people were so depressing because everything was even for them. When I talked to them and I said, what about this or that? They said, I don't know. What can you do? There's nothing you can do. So that was the mantra. What can you do? There's nothing you can do. And then I went to the USA, to New York, and then was there the opposite. You're self-made, you have to do everything, the other extreme. But maybe that's the chance of Europe, to be somewhere in the middle, to have the history of dictatorship, of Holocaust, of all these things where we learn about the dark side of humanity, but also to be a little more modest than the Americans, to know what we can do, to offer a social welfare system, to offer so many things we have created in the last 70 years that we forgot, and that made the life of my family possible as a European story. And I strongly think we have to recreate that sense of what Europe was and not become a tourist museum in all its beauty, and value all these things that we have created because they were created because we had values. And I think that is a crisis we're in. Those values we created, we don't believe in them. We're in this apathetic state, and how to get out of this, that's the question.
Jan Werner, listening to Jagoda, that's what we want to hear from politicians, right?
If I may, let me say something else. I'm getting a tad worried that people are going to go home this morning, the sun is shining, and the conclusion will be again, it was all these liberals on stage, all completely agreeing with each other. So allow me to inject a slight disagreement. It has to do with the story of we, whoever that is, were always so condescending. I think there's a dialectic to this. First of all, nobody's against self-criticism, of course. But I think empirically, for the whole part, the story is actually false. Do you really think that people sit around in bars in, I don't know, Brooklyn and spend all day making fun of rednecks? Plus the fact that more people voted for Trump in New York City than in both Dakotas, North and South combined. So it's also not a simple story about cities versus rural areas. Secondly, disagreement is not disrespect. Criticism is not condescension. Hillary Clinton forever had to apologize, as you all know, for having used the word deplorable. You know what? I think a lot of what Trump has said, what Trump has done, what many of his supporters have supported, is deplorable. This kind of cruelty is not something for which we all of a sudden have to find euphemisms to spare the feelings of some of our fellow citizens. Democracy is about conflict, among other things, and it's okay to have these conflicts openly. Now, two things follow from this. One is that in a weird way, as long as liberals keep saying, oh, the problem is that we're so condescending, even though it sounds like you're being self-critical, at the same time you're kind of affirming it's all about us. It's in our hands. If we, kind of tune it up a little bit, then, it's going to be bad, but if we kind of mute the criticism, then it's going to be okay again. And it sort of was the typical thing that happened in 2016, 2017. Everybody rushed out to buy a book, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, to do with Appalachia, and said, oh, now I understand. And I got to coddle these people and be nice to them and so on. Again, the point is not to disrespect anybody, of course. But to be critical of some of our citizens is not a sign of disrespect. And as long as we kind of continue on this path, the next step is then to say, oh, but you have to make all these concessions. You have to make concessions, of course, on how you talk about immigration and refugees and so on. And that, of course, is the very dynamic that Solly alluded to, that then basically elite actors start to move towards the populist far right. Now, some of you might be in favor of that. Again, I'm not saying that's verboten in a democracy, but we have to be aware of what we're actually doing. One other quick point. I agree, of course, with everything that Jagoda said. It's a real problem that for far too long, if I may put it this way, our side is only ever reacting, right? Oh, look what he's done now, and how do we react to this? And never actually setting the agenda. At the same time, there's a sort of an additional problem in how you get across, basically certain achievements. Who did actually bring broadband to rural America? Trump or Biden? Well, Biden did. Does anybody ever talk about this? No. So everything is connected to everything else. So as long as we have a completely decayed and rotten media infrastructure, you can do all kinds of fantastic, progressive, innovative things. If it doesn't get across to people, you haven't really achieved what you wanted to achieve.
Jan, now we have a problem. Jan, we have a problem now. I agree with you.
That's the point where Sylvie comes in.
Yeah, well, I agree and I don't agree. About this condescending issue, it's important. I think I don't mind being condescending to Trump, but I do think it's a problem if we are condescending, or to Marine Le Pen, to their voters. This is where I have a problem, that we ignored their main concerns, so we have to take this into account when progressive parties, they have to be proactive, they have to have an agenda instead of just criticizing and denying. But regarding the leaders and the political parties, the far-right populist parties, we do have to stick to our values and to principles, and I think voters understand this. For instance, I will take the example of what happened to Marine Le Pen recently. So she was sentenced for embezzlement of public funds, along with 23 other party officials, so she's not alone. But what made the headlines is that she was banned from running for 5 years, right? So there's an appeal now. So she tried to capitalize on this. She abandoned her normalization agenda and took on the Trumpist rhetoric, tried to make people rebel, and she organized a rally in Paris the following Sunday, and she failed. I mean, she did that meeting, that rally was not well attended, and in fact, she's been completely destabilized by this whole issue. Why? Because in the polls, we found that people believed the courts. So she tried to attack the judges. She said they were red judges and that the whole judicial system was politically motivated and stacked against her and trying to kill her politically and so on, because she may not be able to run in 2027. But the fact is that the verdict and the sentence was very well argumented. The courts had a very strong case. They described it very well. It was very widely reported. The court had taken a long time to investigate her case and to document it and so on. And people believed the courts. So, you have to take into account the fact that even among her voters, there are people who still value the rule of law. And this is where we have to be very, very strong, I think.
Can I respond 1 second?
Yeah, of course.
Just 1 second. We ignore their concerns. I mean, for 10 years, we've been talking about nothing but the agenda that has been set by far-right populists. They keep telling us people want to, talk about nothing but migration, refugees, and so on. It's a game you can't win, because even if you make it central, like for instance, it happened in the German election, that empirically it was very clear that was actually not the #1 concern. But at one point, basically, Merz threw in the towel and said, okay, even though I didn't want to make this the central issue in the election, I'll start talking about it now. All journalists want to talk about it, and so on. It's a game you can't win, because even if you then make it central, if you don't adopt the framing of the far right, they are still going to say you're not really talking about it. If you don't talk about it as a threat all the time, they will still come back to you and say, oh, but you're ignoring the concerns of the voters. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about certain things, of course not. But it's always a question of how we talk about them. And as long as you keep making these gradual concessions, you end up in a place where I think you just don't want to be.
I agree.
Solely. The French approach of fighting the far right, if we want to generalize that, and I'll get disagreement in a second, I know, compared to the German way of generalizing a Brandmauer, a firewall against a whole party, and trying to discuss about how they can be forbidden, or that individual approach that the judge did in France. What are your thoughts on these? Can Le Pen be a victim now and monetize or capitalize on that? What are your thoughts?
But based on what Sylvie has said, obviously she will not be able to get a rebound politically on that one. Whereas, I mean, of course, in our case, we just put the mayor of Istanbul in jail, all his associates in jail, now their wives are in jail.
Yeah, that meeting went well, 1.5 million, 2 million on the streets in Istanbul.
Yeah, of course. No, as I said, the resistance is now mobilized, and we'll see how this will all turn out. But to your, so when İmamoğlu was put in jail and then Le Pen was put in, I mean, was sentenced, our guy said, you see, it happens in France. But obviously, I mean, as she said, they had a well-documented, well-argued, seriously investigated case that they presented. Whether or not that will politically fly, I really don't know, but based on what she said, obviously it is not going her way. In our case, there is no evidence. It's so goddamn blatant that the case was about stopping a very potent rival in the next presidential elections, 3 years before the elections are actually scheduled for. There is no evidence in the case.
It's the Putin playbook.
Mm-hmm.
We are original.
Everyone claims to be.
No, the Putin, the thing is, okay, people wonder whether this will be right. I really don't think the Russia case is going to be replicated in Turkey, because whatever you think about Turkey...
I just meant it with putting people in jail or...
They kill too, we don't.
Yeah, yeah.
Journalists are killed in Turkey
Huh?
by embassies. That's happening now.
What?
Oh,
Khashoggi
Khashoggi.
case, yeah.
Khashoggi.
We didn't do it,
I
the
know.
Saudis.
It's the Saudis.
No, but you see, in the Turkish case, the ballot box is actually pretty sacred.
Mm-hmm.
Since 1950, yeah, we had plenty of military interventions and stuff, but our military interventions were usually short. And the ballot box is actually sacred. In fact, one of the reasons why the military actually lost its grip on our politics was because they tampered with the results of the ballot box far too often. And once the Cold War was over, there was really no justification for them to intervene either. And of course, closing down one Islamist party after the other, or one leftist party after the other, or the Kurdish party after the other, didn't really eradicate them. In fact, it made them more potent, all right? And that's why the AKP is emerged as a defender and champion of democracy back in 2002, because the entire system, actually the entire regime by 2001 collapsed, okay? And then we had the constraining factors of the European Union membership process, which Austria opposed, along with others, which was a mistake. And of course, there was also an IMF rational economic program and stuff. And so for about 7 or 8 years, they rode, or they surfed on that wave of liberalizing the country, which also served them to demilitarize the polity. And now we have a civilian replacement for the tutelary system, if you will. But the fact of the matter, again, to repeat what I said earlier, there is resistance, and that resistance is now gaining more strength. Because I want to go back to something, what Jan said, what people deplorable or not. For a long time, the constituencies that voted for Erdogan did not really care about any of the high ground things, you know, like rule of law and all that. Now that an economic crisis is really hitting them in the guts, suddenly what others are saying is being heard. So if you want, you need to have certain conditions as well as a narrative that is different than the ones that the other guys frame to actually mobilize people. And one big difference between earlier times and this time, Erdogan can no longer frame the narrative. Mm-hmm. And finally, the opposition has some intelligence, and they create their own narrative, therefore they don't play in his field. And that is, you're absolutely right. It is essential that you do that you do not accept their vocabulary to discuss practical matters or more esoteric matters in any political game. Sylvie.
Yeah, I wanted to react or to follow up on this resistance theme. That Jan Müller earlier rightly said that. I mean, you pointed out at the limits that the EU is bringing to some populist leaders, including Orban, which is true. And Europe is still a place where we have values and governments in power which implement those values and promote those values. And that's also what's been done at the EU level. But where we are failing at the moment, I think, is about encouraging those resistance movements. So we have in Turkey a very broad popular resistance movement. We have this in Serbia with the students. We have this in Budapest at the moment. We have this in Georgia, where people have been demonstrating every day for I don't know how many months, since October, since the fraudulent election. And what does the EU do, or what do European governments do? Not much. Because we have a very difficult international situation, because we have Ukraine, because we need Turkey in a way in this war. Georgia is another issue, Serbia is another issue, and so I think we wouldn't lose anything in being more vocal in supporting those movements at all levels. And this is something I think it's a big mistake that we're doing.
Jan, how powerful can be resistance? Your part. Jan, how powerful is resistance on one side in Europe, and where is the resistance in the US?
So after a couple of initial weeks of a sense of real defeatism, which was partly, again, sort of encouraged by journalists who said, oh, look, Trump won, he had the mandate, basically echoing what he was saying about himself, plus, as you were rightly saying, Democrats being roughly silent and acting as if everything was normal. By April, I think, early April, we did have plenty of people on the streets. I think it's a very tricky issue that on the one hand, people are very willing to buy into a narrative, which comes from our famous colleagues at Harvard in social science, who said if you can mobilize 3.5% of the population consistently, a regime will be toppled. Sounds great, but in the US context, that means about 11 million people, and we don't have 11 million people on the streets right now.
Yeah.
At the same time, you realize, okay, nothing happens in one day. It's a question of people making connections, consistently getting engaged. I think it's okay to get angry. Sometimes anger is the emotionally appropriate, even also intellectually appropriate response to certain things. So it's definitely not game over. But as we've also seen in many other cases, I'm looking at Solly, you can have people on the streets for a very long time, and a regime simply sits back and says, sure, let them be on the street, you know. Yeah. We don't care. In fact, it's great for us because we can prove to international audiences that we tolerate dissent. And it's you know, we're not autocrats, we're democrats. You know, look how everything is possible. That has also always been the Orban approach. Some of the demonstrations, for instance, in the context of trying to save CEU, the police was even helpful and said, sure, you can sort of still go for an hour. Why don't you go over here, you know, etc. So it's a very ambivalent thing that any sort of simple logic along the lines of, oh, look, there's so many people out there will result in something, alas, you know, is indeed too simple.
So just so we disagree on one thing, no,
Please.
it's just, no, I just wanted to be more precise about the anger. I did not argue against anger. It's a human feeling that, I mean, I don't judge a feeling. I think about the social implications of how we use anger for what happens in our societies. So I think today anger is a currency that is being capitalized through social media by oligarchs and for manipulation, and that we have to be more aware of this emotional quality in the question of how does it evolve in social movements and how is it being manipulated. I mean, we always speak about social media as if it's something happened naturally. It's very designed. So we are, when we put our emotions in the digital sphere, we are in the hands of people with interests. And that has really changed in times where we just met there and expressed our anger and tried to cause social movement in the analog world. I just think we have to think more about this so we can be more aware about how anger is the currency of the oligarchs, to be honest, and techno gigant. But what I think while we talk about all of this is also the currency of attention that we all have and that is so difficult to get in these times, and that we have this, I think, huge problem for I mean, you spoke about my podcast, and in the beginning, the media responsible people were like, she wants to talk serious, and she wants to talk complex, and she wants to talk deep, she wants to talk 90 minutes, and well, she can try, but we will give no budget. So if it's successful, it will work. So we have to really rethink. We have public funding for öffentlich-rechtliche Medien. And we're so afraid to lose them for good reasons. But in the end, it's again the same thing. What kind of attention is being fostered there? I mean, you just said people listen to the radio for hours. Now they listen to podcasts for hours. It's such a huge possibility to enter the decision-making processes of people. In the US, Joe Rogan has understood the game. In the last American elections, many people say Trump, it's been a podcast election because he went to those big podcasts to just channel through the ears into people's brains. Are we aware of this? And let's take the examples you have used about how much do we speak about all those resistance movements. I have tried, I mean, because the Serbian movement and its complexity and its beauty and its hope and all that it carries, these immense pictures these people produce, this immense energy that goes through Europe or should be going, I wouldn't have heard of it if I was not connected through Instagram with a lot of people who are living in Serbia, who live in Vienna and report about these people. So I think we have to be careful with demonizing social media because still there's many...
we have to use them.
Yeah, we have to use them rightly.
Absolutely, I agree.
And then I try to put this information into the few potential things that I have access to. I have a news podcast that's one of the best heard news podcasts in Germany. But to bring this into the news cycle, like 1 of 8 news should be reported daily. It's always, but we have Trump doing this, Trump doing that, Trump doing this. And I was like, well, I can do a whole show without Trump. And our listeners are very fine with it. And German news broadcasts have created, I think, 15 Trump effect podcasts since Trump is now in power.
AI
Trump
generated.
in day 97, Trump in day 93, Trump here, Trump there. And I really wonder how much Trump do we need? And on the other hand, we say we want democracy, we want these movements. So what I really think we have to be much more serious about is we are so mourning the media and the loss that we get there, but I think it's again, Easter, you said this renewal, new rebirthing. How can we be reborn in the way we use media to get people's attention? And I think we're in a very good time because we can access people's minds. They're willing to, if I called any of you today to talk 90 minutes, we have more than 200 people driving their bicycles and their trains and listening to us as if we knew something about the world. We don't. We're trying and we share, and they share with us, and it's such a great experience of community and of democracy. So we have tons of tools, but how do we use it? And I think media is in this sphere one huge part of the problem, the crisis we're in.
See, Jan, there's my optimism.
There's my
We have 12 minutes left, I guess, and we don't want to have your meals waiting for you. So I've learned some things, and let's compress what we've learned today to take it with us in this election Sunday that's going to be, well, let's see, maybe it's interesting, maybe it's not. But what I wanted to come to is a playbook for liberal democracy, and a playbook for something sounds way better than to be against something, as we've heard from Jagoda now. So a playbook for liberal democracy. And yes, white, male, liberal democracy, would we want to go back to that? Or what would be your top 3 priorities that should be taken into consideration to go towards what we consider in this very positive podium, consider going to a good way?
In 3 minutes.
You might have 4. And now it's 3:50.
Okay, so everything has been said, but not everybody has said it.
Go for it.
So I won't repeat all these important points about not always reacting, having a positive agenda, focusing on real problems such as affordable housing, which very often has been the #1 real concern among voters until far-right populists came along and convinced everybody that actually no, it's migration. I'm not going to repeat all these points. But in terms of playbook or what to do or who really matters, allow me to reframe it a little bit. As some of our colleagues have now been saying for many years, very often, not always, but very often, the fate of liberal democracy is not a matter of, in narrow sense, liberals. It's a matter of how conservative elites decide. This is not a new phenomenon. A couple of years back, we were thinking back to 100 years after the March on Rome. Yes, there was a march on Rome, but we sometimes forget that Mussolini didn't march on Rome. He arrived very comfortably by sleeper car from Milan because elites had invited him to govern. And we've seen a very similar dynamic today. There is no populist wave, even though people keep repeating this phrase, as if people wake up one morning and say, oh, from now on, I want right-wing populism. No, there are some people who can be mobilized because they have these attitudes, and all of a sudden they have a supply. That's the German story. All of a sudden you have a right-wing extremist party that you didn't have before. And you have conservative elites who in many countries, I'm not going to lecture you about Austria, are basically willing to say, yes, it's acceptable to copy how they talk, or it's acceptable to cooperate with them directly. And that in so many countries has made the difference. That is also the story about what happened in the United States. If it was only a MAGA movement by itself, we would be in a completely different situation than the one we are in. So to the extent that you know anybody who is part of a conservative elite, talk to them, tell them that you're watching them, tell them that you're sanctioning them for behavior which you find unacceptable. That was maybe more concrete than you were bargaining for, but that's actually, I think, the most direct and concrete lesson beyond all the important other stuff about better policies, which nobody disagrees with.
Cool. Sylvie, we have been all lectured with constructive journalism over all those years. How constructive can we be going on, and what would be your wishes, your desires?
There are 2 things I may insist on, and they are not exclusive, of course. There are many things we can do, but one thing is the rule of law. I think we have to stand by the rule of law, promote the rule of law, don't give up on the rule of law. People pay attention, at least in Europe, definitely, and it's really it must be one of our top priority in the fight. The second thing is more complicated. It's this technology issue. It's not only about how we use social media, and I totally agree with Jagoda about the podcast, about how, when I mentioned this student about, saying she get her news from Instagram and TikTok, my point was that we have to be there too. And we do, but maybe we don't do it intelligently enough. But the tech bros agenda, I mean, we have to go to the bottom of this and look. When you read what Marc Andreessen says, or Peter Thiel, or what Musk says, I mean, sometimes it's just completely crazy. And so we have to take this seriously, debunk it, including this. There's something which I find really troubling. It's this, I don't know if you say virilist in English, masculinist ideology. It's extremely dangerous to women. And then you have Musk going around with his polygamy thing. And I mean, where are we? We really have to pay attention to all these ideologies which seem to come from nowhere, but they are there. And we have to fight this very seriously, I think.
Yeah, that. Sorry, we used to have this term, as I said in the beginning, foreseeable future. Well, I don't know if there's any foreseeable future at this point. There is future for sure, and things we should fight for, we should go on the street for. What are your thoughts?
Well, Sam Huntington used to use relevant future rather than foreseeable future. And actually, it makes sense to me. So let's talk about the relevant future, because I don't know, do you know what's going to happen tomorrow? Look, this is a fight. The pendulum has swung back. There is a conservative backlash. Whether or not they are a majority, or I don't know. But, and as Sylvie said, it is anti-woman. It is anti-liberal. It has certainly in the West, it has a very Christian nationalist or civilizational thing, but it also has a very civilizational aspect in China and in India as well. It's not just the West that is reacting in a certain way to the progress that societies have made. I think one should not underestimate that Modi was expected to win by a landslide, and he did not win by a landslide, which again goes back to my theme of resistance. The decks are stacked in favor of those who want authoritarianism, I would say, especially on the part of the techno-bros who actually don't mind this, in the way that the American corporations, law firms have caved into Trump and basically showed no backbone. I have to say, surprised that Harvard ultimately decided to stand up, because I was at Harvard when they dismissed the director of the Center for Middle East Studies and pretended that he was stepping down out of his own will. And then he said, no, I was thrown out. And so from that, a week or 10 days later, for Harvard to basically reject the Trump pressures, sue the Trump administration, find actually allies among many, many colleges, suggests that now a reaction is being built up. And so that this back and forth, this struggle, sometimes perhaps violent, is going to continue. And I cannot say I predict that the good side will win, but the good side does have a fighting chance, and we should come up with whatever ingenious ways of supporting that fight so that it ends up with the good side winning.
That sounds promising. And Jagoda, what we're more missing is confidence and trust. Do you have a way back to more confidence, more trust?
Maybe on my little individual level, but on this huge thing that we're talking about, societies, futures, I have thought of three things. I had the privilege that I could think of all things you said. So I think one I find very urgent, and I will in the end say something that I find, one thing at the moment I find something urgent to prevent the worst, and that is really to fight against the precarization of the middle class, so to say, because we tackled the housing thing, and I find that there are people scared of being excluded from our societies that used to be the elite in our societies. So this fear of tomorrow is going to be bad for me and my family and my kids is so big and so widespread that I think that is an undercurrent fear noise that goes on in the unconscious or subconscious in our societies that can really be pushed from the anti-democrats very easily, because it's like this system doesn't work if you're so scared, and we have the solutions. We're the strong ones. We're the strong ones. So I think that's something that I really want, is that we do something against this fear of ending in a precarious situation or your children ending there. The second I think is really important is education, culture, things that are now being cut. I mean, Trump is fighting education because that is part of the democratic promise. That is part of enlightenment. Education is what gives us the tools to actually be a democratic society. So if that is a system that's getting worse and worse, we are in a crisis anyway. So I really hope we find a better solution to tackle our education and cultural programs, because they're cutting everywhere. And I really think we need to find a strategy to do sowas wie Volksbildung in media literacy. If we don't educate people, I wonder how they will be able to differentiate between everything that in the future AI will be able to produce and present as a potentially real story, when they are not even sure what is reality and what I can believe in. And I think that again is causing a fear that again is very easy to capitalize by certain political forces. And then that's maybe the part where I'm in as a novelist or storyteller. I believe that we strongly have to use forces and public spaces to create our own stories and recreating a broader narrative of interdependency, because the nationalist, the anti-diverse thinking has been so loud and has gotten so much access now into people's brains that I think we have to find ways to recreate the myth of being European, the myth of being a global citizen, and that we cannot solve our problems, starting with climate crisis, if we don't think of each other as interdependent, and that we will not solve our problems by just building a wall against everybody else in Europe so we can be safe, that we have to be strong in finding interdependent stories that make us strong and that have the capacity to speak of the future as something more than the loss of the past. I think that's the biggest danger we're in. We have to speak of the future as the potentially imagined, not present that we are waiting for, and not the loss of the past.
Gerald, one sentence. Just one sentence.
Only if you don't agree.
Huh?
Only
Oh no. We need to have functioning states that are financially solvent for all those things to actually be realized. That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, I guess we have to end today's discussion at this point. We all from here, we do sincerely thank you for being here, being so interested on a sunny Sunday. I'm happy that our partners, the IWM, the ERSI Foundation, the wonderful Burgtheater, of course, made it possible to make this, and also with today's discussion, the longest running series of discussion at their standard. It runs for over 17 years and will be, my impression from today is it will run way more than 17 years, and I guess we could talk for 17 years today, but we'll stop at this point. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you to all the partners, and the last applause should be for Sylvie Kauffmann, Jagoda Marinić, Jan Werner Müller, Sole Özil. Thank you for being here.